Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we bravely poke the hornet's nest of history. Today, we're tackling a big one: what colonialism did for Taiwan and Japan. That's right, from 1895 to 1945, Japan ruled Taiwan, and, surprise, they left behind a whole lot more than just railways and sugar factories. We're talking about massive social and economic changes that, believe me, still spark intense debates today.
So, was it progress? Was it pure exploitation? Or was it just, colonialism with better trains? We're going to unpack all of it with our usual blend of sarcasm and skepticism. And a huge shout out to our producer, FireflyHaku, who wrangles this whole thing the way empires only wish they could have wrangled their colonies.
All right, let's set the scene. When Japan got its hands on Taiwan back in 1895, it was their very first colony, and they weren't just winging it. They had a very, very specific vision. They wanted to turn this island into an agricultural engine to power the homeland.
And wow, the contrast is pretty stark. Before 1895, under Qing rule, Taiwan was, well, a bit of a backwater. It was mostly agrarian, had hardly any infrastructure to speak of, and malaria was everywhere. Japan looks at this and basically thinks, perfect. Their plan was to forge it into an agricultural appendage, a place to supply massive amounts of sugar and rice. This wasn't just random either. Back home, the Japanese people had a new sweet tooth for Western-style candies, so they needed a cheap, reliable source of sugar. Taiwan was the answer. But here's the thing. Before Japan could build a single factory or lay a single track, they had to control the island. And that meant using brutal, overwhelming force to pacify a population that, unsurprisingly, was not exactly thrilled about having new bosses.
The early years were just incredibly violent. Starting in 1898, the colonial government executed an average of 716 people every single year for what they called banditry, which, let's be honest, was often just a catch-all term for any act of resistance. This wasn't policing. This was mass suppression.
And that control was maintained by a truly staggering police presence. We're talking one police officer for every 600 civilians. Patrols could happen up to 6 times a day. The result was a pervasive police state, constant surveillance, searches, seizures. Resistance was systematically crushed.
So, with the resistance stamped out, Japan got to work. By 1908, they'd finished a critical railway linking the main harbors and built modern irrigation systems. By 1920, a modern financial system was in place, 5 modern banks, and hundreds of credit co-ops where there had been basically nothing before. They were building their economic machine piece by powerful piece.
Now here's something that's maybe less flashy than a new railway, but was absolutely crucial. Japan invested a ton in a proper land survey to establish modern land rights. This did 2 really important things. 1, it gave farmers the security they needed to actually invest in their own land. And 2, it created a stable, predictable tax base for the colonial government, which meant they didn't have to keep asking Tokyo for money.
Okay, so Taiwan is being completely remade. But this is where the story takes a really fascinating turn, because these colonial policies started to boomerang back and affect Japan itself, creating a massive and completely unintended crisis back home. Flashback to 1918. In Japan, things are not great. Soaring food prices sparked what became known as the rice riots. We're talking huge social upheaval, over 66,000 protesters on the streets. The government actually collapsed. The new administration had one primary goal: find cheap rice, fast, to calm the cities. And where did they look? Straight to their colonies. The result was basically a green revolution in Taiwan, supercharged by Japanese agricultural tech. And you can see the results right here. Taiwanese rice exports to Japan just exploded. They went from about 113,000 tons in 1915 to over 700,000 tons just 20 years later. Problem solved, right?
Well, not exactly. In a classic case of unintended consequences, this flood of cheap colonial rice completely collapsed prices back in Japan. Sure, it calmed the cities, but it absolutely devastated Japan's own rural economy. This created a whole new wave of anger and social disorder, which became the perfect recruiting tool for Japanese militarists. They promised to restore farmers' dignity through foreign conquest. It's a truly shocking chain of events.
Okay, let's pivot back to Taiwan. With all this economic development happening, did it actually make life better for the average Taiwanese person? The answer is yes, but with some huge caveats. Japanese public health initiatives, especially things like malaria control, had a massive impact. Just look at these numbers. In 1906, life expectancy was a grim 29 years old. By the late 1930s, it had jumped to 45. That is a staggering improvement in just one generation.
And get this, the change was so dramatic, you could literally see it. Because of better nutrition and health, Taiwanese men actually got taller. And the biggest gains in height happened during the colonial period. At the same time, school attendance went through the roof, from just 13% to over 71%. People were living longer, healthier, and more educated lives.
But, and this is a big but, who was actually in charge? Despite being just 6% of the population, Japanese colonists held nearly 3/4 of all government jobs and 70% of the top technician roles. So the Taiwanese were living in a much nicer house, but they were never allowed to hold the keys. And you can imagine the position this put the Taiwanese elite in. They were getting wealthy within the Japanese system, but they were completely shut out of real power. They campaigned for more participation, for home rule, but they never dared question the colonial system itself. It was a frustrating, delicate balancing act.
And then everything changes. World War II ends, Japan surrenders, and the colonial period is officially over. But as the Japanese packed their bags, they left behind one final unintentional gift that would radically reshape Taiwan's future.
So in the chaos of the war's end, as the Japanese were scrambling to get out, all their assets, factories, monopolies, houses, and huge tracts of land were suddenly up for grabs. They were either seized by the new government, the Chinese nationalists or KMT, or sold off at fire sale prices to locals. This created incredible wealth almost overnight, and, most importantly, gave the new government a massive public land bank to play with. And what the KMT did with this land became one of the most successful land reforms in modern history. It was a 3-step process. First, they capped rents. Next, they sold off all that former Japanese land directly to the farmers who worked it. And finally, they forced the big landlords to sell off their excess land to their tenants. This whole program was only possible because they had seized all those Japanese assets to begin with. The result? Nothing short of a complete social transformation. By 1970, nearly 80% of Taiwanese farmers owned the land they worked. This was a monumental shift away from a system where a tiny elite owned almost everything. It turned out to be this incredible win-win-win situation. The farmers got land and productivity soared. The old landlords, they were paid off with stock in those former Japanese industries, turning them into a new class of industrialists. And the KMT government got the political support it desperately needed. The great irony? Taiwan's post-war economic miracle was built, in a very real way, on the foundations left behind by the colonizers.
Grateful for your ears. Spread the word and join us again soon.